Kia ora koutou. I'm Sarah Bell, Project Lead at the Helen Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar on housing, energy and sustainability. Before we get started, a few quick notes. This is the first of the webinars in our Facing Up to the Future series, launched alongside the book of the same name, edited by Peter Davis, who's with us on the panel today. The book's available for pre-order, and my colleague Victoria will drop a purchase link in the chat shortly, and our members get $15 off the book with a code that was sent out to your inboxes on the 26th of June if you want to track that down. So this month we have an exciting lineup of our 4 Facing Up to Our Future webinars. Our next webinar in the series is on Wednesday the 15th at 1:30 p.m, featuring Fran O'Sullivan, Matt Nolan, Toby Moore, Tim Maloney, John Duffy and Michael Johnston, discussing productivity, inequality and prosperity over the long term. If you're not already a member of the Foundation, we'd love to have your support as we grow our independent, non-partisan and evidence-based think tank. Membership is affordable and takes only a couple of minutes to set up through the link that Victoria will put in the chat. And we do have an exciting membership promo going on at the moment, and you can see our website for the details of that. Finally, as we always say, but if this is for your first time joining one of our webinars, please be reassured that your cameras and microphones are disabled for the duration of the webinar. You can safely eat your lunch and drink your cup of tea without being seen or heard. We would love for you to participate in the webinar, though. The best way to do that is to ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can do that throughout the webinar whenever a question occurs to you, and our moderator, Sarah Sinclair, will put those questions to the panelists at around the 12:45 mark. You're also welcome to engage with each other in the chat function, but please make sure those questions for the panel go into the Q&A. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to Sarah to introduce our panelists and lead us through some opening questions. Thanks, Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah, and kia ora tātou, everyone, and welcome to a really fantastic opportunity to lift our heads to the horizon. New Zealand's most serious long-term challenges are quite literally written into the places that we live, and they share a very frustrating quality. Across the environment, energy, housing in our cities, the problem is really a shortage of good ideas. We are abound with good ideas, but what we struggle with is sticking with them. Settings get introduced by one government, unwound by the next, and the long-term problems just keep compounding as the flip-flopping continues. Today, what we want to ask our panelists to help us think about is that long game. What are the structural choices in front of us across these 4 areas? And what would it take to make good decisions that stick beyond a single electoral cycle? We are extremely fortunate to have 4 contributors from the Facing Up to Our Future Challenges and Choices for New Zealand book that Sarah mentioned in the introduction. And I'll just quickly introduce the 4 contributors who are going to speak today to you. First, Greg Severinsen, who's the Reform Director at the Environmental Defence Society and author of the chapter in the book around steps for environmental improvement and true sustainability. Dr. Rod Carr, the inaugural chair of New Zealand's Climate Change Commission and a leading voice, I think that understates it, Dr. Rod, on the country's climate and energy transition, and author of the chapter on strategic agenda for the energy transition. Emeritus Professor Peter Davis, editor of the Facing Up to Our Future and author of the chapter on housing dysfunction and reform. And Mark Thomas, Managing Director of urban advisory firm ServiceWorks, Regional Lead for the Smart Cities Council, and an expert, true expert in city performance and smart cities, and an advocate for cities. And he leads the State of the City report and project in Auckland and is the author of the chapter of Auckland's Unrealised Primacy. So welcome to the 4 of you, and we will get straight in to the conversation. The conversation is going to be in 2 rounds. The first one is round 1 that we're calling the diagnosis, which will diagnose the problem, and round 2 is going to be around the problem and the choices, sorry. So starting with round 1, question for you, Greg, I'm going to start with you. Your chapter makes the pointed argument that New Zealand's environmental decline is not a scientific problem, but a regulatory and political one. The rules exist, we have the tools, but they lack the hard limits. Enforcement is weak and economic interests routinely override environmental ones. You note in the book that we have proportionally more threatened or at-risk species than any other country, that our water quality is in dire straits, and that environmental degradation could cost the tourism sector up to 938 million a year, so close to $1 billion a year cost on our country. Can you paint this picture for us, and what would be your proposed framework of a binding biophysical limits with no balancing against economic factors, and what would that actually change?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Sarah. And what a wonderful idea this book is, I might add. I will start by painting a bit of a picture. But the really fundamental point, I think, is that without a functioning and healthy environment, our economy, our way of life, our health, pretty much all of the other topics that are dealt with in this book, collapse. So we have got nothing. The environment is a human habitat as well, and we're losing it. So national level reporting is telling us this kind of thing over and over again. So, for example, 46% of groundwater sites didn't meet drinking water standards for E. coli at least once between 2019 and 2024. Excuse me, 2024. Between 2016 and 2020, almost half of the country's river length was not suitable for swimming, and over half suffered from organic pollution. More than half of our rare ecosystems are at risk of collapse. 90% of wetlands have been lost since pre-human settlement. And yeah, 4,000 threatened species. I mean, that's astonishing, the highest in the world. And I guess this stuff isn't just numbers. It matters in a really tangible sense. So, for example, as you mentioned, Sarah, tourism losses could be up to almost $1 billion a year from some of this stuff. One council's having to spend $5 million to search for a new source of safe drinking water because some of the existing ones are dangerous for babies. 70% of export earnings are dependent on natural capital. We're heavily dependent. And free trade agreements are increasingly imposing robust environmental standards that we're at risk of falling foul of. So this stuff really does matter in a bunch of ways. But just quickly coming to the second bit of your question about biophysical limits. We have a lot of rules. We've got a lot of process churn, and that's frustrating for everyone, including environmental advocates. It's hard to build a deck, absolutely. But at the same time, what we also haven't got are strong lines in the sand, where the law says no more harm, no matter what. So instead, we've got these exhausting processes that might take some of the sharp edges off harm, but still allow big cumulative impacts to happen. And that comes from a whole lot of places, but the Resource Management Act, or RMA, is a big part of it, which has allowed for long-term harm to kind of be balanced against short-term economic benefit. So just a couple of examples. In Canterbury, that means that large dairy expansions have continued to be consented despite nitrate contamination getting worse across many groundwater sites. And I might add, despite many really protective sounding aspirations in the plan. So there's this gulf between what we want and what we're getting. And it means, once rights to pollute have been granted, sometimes for up to 35 years, it's really hard to claw them back. So we're left in this position where taxpayers have had to fork out for voluntary measures, like buying back $80 million of discharge permits around Lake Taupo. Here's the proposition. And it really isn't rocket science. We need a system where a limit actually means a limit, not where we just kind of bend the rules when things get a bit hard. Firm lines in the sand for fresh water, for soil, for air, for biodiversity, strictly preventing activities where they'd breach them. And those would be actual numbers. They would have actual rapid consequences. They wouldn't take into account short-term economic benefits or trade-offs. And they would trigger automatic responses, like a legal requirement to decline or review consents or change a plan. And that kind of system may well cause people to rethink how land is used in the first place. So rather than just trying and failing to manage the effects of what we have always done. And just finally, I'd note there's a big opportunity right now because the Resource Management Act is being repealed and replaced. So striking while the iron is hot right now makes this a really important election issue.
Thanks, Greg. Rod, I'm going to turn to you, and I think there's a good link and segue here, because your chapter contains a really striking reframing around energy, and you argue that New Zealand's dependence on fossil fuels and fumes, but fossil fuels, is no longer a technology problem because renewable alternatives are available and they are cheaper. But this is also a political problem. You point out that we import 60 million barrels of oil each year at a cost of over $7 billion, with only 30 days of onshore storage, and that electricity makes up just 40% of our total energy use. I think often a point that's missed, even though 85% of our electricity generation is renewable. Can you explain why you say the barriers are now political rather than technical, and the interests that you see standing in the way?
Kia ora, Sarah, and good to have this opportunity. The technologies that New Zealand needs, not necessarily applicable across the world, but that New Zealand needs to shake off the shackles of being a colony in a global fossil fuels empire, exist today. We don't need to invent any new solar panels, batteries, heat pumps, LED lighting. All of these technologies, if taken up in New Zealand today, will reduce our dependence on long supply chains of fossil fuels at global prices we cannot control, and we will reap the benefits of not combusting fossil fuels in the open air at ground level. We don't need nuclear power. What we need to do is clearly understand why, when it is in our economic and national security interest to decarbonise low and medium temperature process heat and transport, we are not doing this at pace. We are falling behind even Australia when it comes to decarbonising our households and our businesses. And the answer is not technology and no longer even economics. The reality is that whether it is because our leaders are complacent, captured, or corrupt, we are denying our own national interest by obfuscating the truth. And the truth is that the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air has huge externalities, not just on ecosystems, not just on climate and weather, but on our own health. So who benefits by delaying the transition? Well, those stakeholders with vested interests earning economic rents from the old technology. Remember, half of global fossil fuel supplies are owned by sovereign states. Remember, the economic rents that accrue to the producers of coal, fossil gas, and liquid petroleum are enormous. The wealth and power not only poisons the global discourse by obfuscating the true science, but also underpins the economic rents that accrue to foreigners. New Zealand, as an island nation acting in our own national interest, should decarbonise wherever possible as fast as possible. And yet our public policies are at least at standstill and in some cases going backwards. We need to be very clear that households look to governments for leadership, and that if the leadership is lacking, inertia will compel households to be trapped in a poverty trap not of their making. 3 simple examples. Households that run incandescent lighting instead of LED lighting are paying $300 a year more in electricity bills than they need to. Households that drive internal combustion engine cars are paying 25 cents a kilometre for their energy whereas a battery electric car energy cost 5 cents a kilometre. And households that are on gas for their hot water heating are paying nearly 4 times as much for their energy as a household on a heat pump hot water cylinder. There is a capital barrier to acquiring those technologies, and that capital barrier can be addressed in both the public and the private sector. The challenge for New Zealand is that at the moment it is the wealthier and higher income households that are able to manage and reduce their energy costs, while low income households are caught in the poverty trap, and often disinformation and misinformation propagated by those with economic interests in slowing or delaying the transition. We need to call out those stakeholders with vested interests, and we need to ensure that they do not hold the regulatory pen that leads to massive public subsidies for heavy freight on our road and diesel, for the continuing supply of inadequate old technologies that are not in our interests.
I know we're going to get questions, Rod. I know. Make sure you pop your questions in the Q&A. There's lots of good stuff here. I'm writing mine down too. Peter, I want to turn to you now. Your chapter argues that New Zealand does not have a cyclical housing shortage, but a structural system failure. Owner occupation has fallen from a peak of 74% in 1991 to below 65% today. Nearly 2/3 of all bank lending now goes to housing, crowding out productive business investment, and the wealthiest 10% of households own nearly half of all of the wealth. You also make the point that housing has become the primary store of wealth for a large and electorally powerful voting bloc, which itself magnifies the resistance to reform. Could you please set out how we got here to this space, and so blimmin' quickly, it seems to me, and why you say this is a structural rather than just a bad patch in the cycle?
Thank you. Yes, I've done quite a bit of work on this, and mostly it's been on just trying to get the background. And I was surprised myself, I have to say, having had a reasonable housing trajectory myself, to realize that it's not a good story. I mean, if you look internationally and use the OECD statistics, New Zealand is among the least affordable for house prices, for rentals. It has some of the highest homeless rates. It has low social housing, and yet it invests more than almost other OECD countries in housing. So it's a bit like the story on infrastructure, where we find that in the OECD, we're among the highest in investing in infrastructure, but we're just not getting value for money. And I think the same thing's happening in housing, is that essentially there's a lot of money going in, it's chasing prices, but it's not creating construction and supply. So we're in a bit of we're batting prices backwards and forwards between homeowners and investors, and we're using demand subsidies for rental accommodation rather than actually building more of the stuff. So I can't explain why I really can't completely explain how we got there, but I'm just going to give you some idea of the background. So I'm a sociologist, and so I sort of bring a number of things together. I follow the media, etc. So I don't know how many of you know, but in the 17 years leading up to 2020, New Zealand went from 4 million people to 5 million. In other words, we added a quarter to our population without debate. I never heard anybody say, "Wow, yeah, let's increase our population by a quarter." No one said a thing along those lines. Instead, it was mainly migration, and it seemed okay at the time. But just imagine that pressure on infrastructure. All of a sudden, we had to find accommodation for a population that had increased from 4 million to 5 million. So population is one part. It's not the biggest part. A lot of it's to do with land and the value of land. Secondly, cultural preference. I don't know if any of you are aware of an English politician and journalist called Austin Mitchell. And he used to be at Otago University, and he was a very clever guy, and he used to write things. And he wrote a book, tongue-in-cheek, about his time in New Zealand in the 1960s, which was Quarter Acre Pavlova Paradise. And at that time, anyone could aspire to getting a quarter-acre section with a picket fence, jump in their car or grab the bus and go to work and come home again, and everything will be there. And if you look at the state houses, they're also on quarter-acre sections. So there's a cultural preference, essentially, for standalone homes. That's the idea of the ideal for the family concept. The traditional nuclear family is going to be in there. And that also, I mean, quite aside from the fact that it's there, is that it also has influenced planning decisions. Since the 1980s, town planning has essentially been organized around trying to make sure that almost everybody can actually live in something that looks like a quarter-acre section Pavlova paradise. Now, in 2015, Auckland tried to introduce, had this unitary plan thing. It was implemented in 2016. In 2015, the Prime Minister at the time, John Key, said, Kiwis have just got to get used to the fact that they might be living in an apartment. And I thought, thank God somebody said that. Thank God somebody at the highest political level has said, hey guys, he didn't actually mention the quarter-acre section Pavlova Paradise, but in a way, he put his finger on something that we just got to get used to, the idea that maybe at the beginning of your life, at the end of your life, you'll be in an apartment, and then during the middle, you might be in a house or whatever. So anyway, we've got that cultural thing that has actually influenced a lot of planning decisions, and it's only been quite recent that we've had to untangle those planning decisions to make it easier to build apartments, townhouses, more compact cities, rather than urban sprawl, which is essentially that concept of the quarter-acre section was a recipe for urban sprawl. What else? As I mentioned, there's regulations, there's a tax settings. At present, without a proper capital gains tax, and investors getting other benefits, like being able to set costs against their other income, the poor old householder is stuck with a mortgage, and they're up against these competitors in the marketplace. That I think it will be very useful. And I can't imagine why there wouldn't be a cross-party agreement that, frankly, we want to encourage productive investment rather than speculation in housing. So there's a tax setting. There's supply. So the crazy thing is we're the highest investor. And in fact, by the way, people worry about us having nearly 50% of public debt. Individual personal debt is 150% of GDP. And most of that is in housing. So, we're all in debt personally for this housing thing. And the crazy thing is we aren't getting value for money. So why aren't we getting supply? And frankly, I find that a little bit difficult to answer. I think it's partly to do with the regulations. It's partly to do with the fragmented nature of the housing building industry. It's also volatility. So that at present, we've got housing outfits going bust all over the place. And all of a sudden, we'll get an opening up and everyone will start building again. Well, you can't. You need a pipeline type concept, which is where the Infrastructure Commission comes in. And finally, land. So in the end, the constraint, if you're in the South Island, in somewhere near Christchurch, you can probably still build a quarter-acre section of Pavlova Paradise. But in Auckland, you're pushing up against all sorts of limits. You've got the Waitakaris. Does that mean you're going to start logging in the Waitakaris to build there? You're talking about limits from a point of view of floodplains and the like. At the time in 2023, there was big storms in Auckland, and a whole lot of people had to leave their homes in areas where they should never have been built. And the government and Auckland Council had to spend 2.5 billion buying out 1,250 homes. So you've got that constraint. Doesn't stop a fast track outfit by Winton Building with want to build 4,000 houses in the floodplain in South Auckland. So when I drive down to the motorway, I can see a strip development. There will be 100 kilometres of development from Drury to Warkworth if we're not careful. And so that's why we have to curb urban sprawl. So those are some of the sort of background things. So I'd say that suggests to you that it is structural. It is a bit of cyclical, like the global financial crisis came along, bang, and others. The COVID, suddenly all money was available and everyone started buying things up, and there was an asset value boom. So mostly there are the things that I've mentioned which are there, which don't change much, but could be changed, and it's hard to see why people can't agree across the political spectrum to do so.
Thank you, Peter. Very, very relevant to the conversations happening in Auckland right now, all of those points. So thank you very much. I can see people, I can see questions. I can just see the number ticking up on my screen. Just remember to upvote, because we are going to be constrained on time. So put your ticks next to the little thumbs up against the questions that you most like, so we get the most popular questions when we come to that. Mark, turning to you now, our fabulous city advocate, your chapter reframes Auckland in a way that some people outside the city may find provocative, and I'm sure that's deliberate. You argue that Auckland is not a regional issue to be periodically managed, but New Zealand's primary economic platform, generating 38% of our national GDP, and that its underperformance is therefore a national penalty, not Auckland's problem alone. You note that congestion alone is estimated to cost $2.6 billion a year by 2026, and that 15 years on from amalgamation, there really hasn't been a step change in Auckland. Can you explain why you say the whole country pays for Auckland's underperformance, and where are the biggest gaps?
Sarah, thanks, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Look, the reason this matters to the rest of New Zealand is simple, unfortunately. Auckland's one of the main ways the country pays its bills. 38% of GDP is well known. That's the current size. That's only going to grow. Auckland's only going to become even more economically significant to New Zealand. And so when the Auckland transport system's unreliable, when its housing's too expensive, when firms can't scale as they should, that cost is not confined just to Auckland. It means overall lower productivity, less company earnings, lower wages, fewer job opportunities, and much less tax revenue for the whole country. So congestion is an example I pulled out, not just as an Auckland annoyance. 29 million hours on average we all spend sitting in cars if we're on the motorways in Auckland, but it's a productivity tax of the order of, as you said, 2.6 billion that affects the whole national economy. A rough way to think about it is this. Auckland's economy produces around $158 billion. That's a rough proxy for the 38%. And let's say Auckland's underperforming by 10%. Now, you mentioned at the start we do the annual State of the City report. Last year, when we looked at Auckland's productivity, in fact, it was assessed as being at the bottom of the 9 peer cities. So that 10% may be conservative, but let's use that as an underperformance metric. That would mean that's $16 billion worth of national output that's not being contributed. And in terms of tax, on current tax settings, that means roughly $4 to $5 billion less Crown revenue each year. So that's less revenue going to hospitals in the South Island, to schools in the Bay of Plenty, to infrastructure up north. The money raised in Auckland does not stay in Auckland. It gets distributed around the rest of the country. So that is unfortunately the reason why the rest of New Zealand has to care. This affects everyone because it just reduces the investment opportunities available in Auckland, but more importantly for the rest of the country. So my argument's not that Auckland deserves special attention just because it's big. It's that New Zealand is continuing to incur the cost of the economic platform that we are operating below capacity. On the biggest gaps, they are unfortunately in the areas where Auckland's scale should be creating the biggest national dividend. I mean, it's clear we have significant assets in Auckland. That's an important point to make. A natural environment, our cultural diversity. We have actually internationally acknowledged assets. But unfortunately, on the downside, these productivity deficits are in areas like innovation, for example. We're not short of smart people doing smart things. That's not the problem. We do have, though, a very low overall spending on research and development, well below the OECD average. We are capital constrained, not just a function of our size and our distance from markets. We don't have a mature, attractive capital market the way comparable small advanced economies have. And we're skill constrained too, particularly in emerging economies. So those things impact on innovation. Transport, we've talked about. Housing and infrastructure, we know we're billions of dollars behind. Sarah, you know this well from your background, in terms of the infrastructure we should have spent, and we haven't yet demonstrated we've got the ability to spend it consistently well. So these are some of the gaps that affect not just actually Auckland, other parts of the country too. We're not short of plans or ideas. The problem is in governance, funding, and an infrastructure pipeline that keeps being reset. So the national issue is that we're under-contributing in precisely the systems that matter most. And that's the opportunity we have before us.
Thank you, Mark. Now, that was what we were calling round one, people. That was, I think, you have a very good sense on the perspectives on the diagnosis, which was round one. And now round two, sounds a bit like a boxing match. It's not intended to, but round two is around the choices. So I'm going to speak to each participant again around the choices that we have as we lift. Remember, this is about lifting our heads to the horizon and thinking about that long-term, those long-term choices. So coming back to you, Greg, your prescription has three parts: a statutory framework of binding limits that cannot be traded away against the economic factors, a polluters pays principle with legislated restoration targets, and then thirdly, a mandatory strategic spatial planning that identifies genuine no-go zones. But underpinning all of it, you argue for a deeper mental and I sort of think societal cultural shift, that environmental and economic well-being are synergistic rather than competing with each other. And we should stop treating GDP as our primary measure of success. Of the practical reforms, where would you start? And how do you persuade a growth-focused government that protecting the environment is, as you put it, a uniquely lucrative investment?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. There's a bit to unpack there, but I'll just start with your second question first, perhaps. The environment is a uniquely valuable investment. I think, as a bit of an aside, I do think it would be good to change our mindset, our language, how we describe the stuff, away from just an economic lens. Caring for the environment is amoral, it's a social question. Innovations like legal personhood for nature may help to shift that kind of mindset. Or indeed, we could channel our inner Bhutan, which measures gross national happiness and not just GDP. So there are some wonderful things we can be doing on that front. But at the end of the day, it just makes economic sense to look after nature. I mean, for example, as I say in the chapter, the EU has calculated that every euro invested in nature will give back a 4 to 38 euro return. I mean, if you saw that on a prospectus, you would be astonished. A UK study also shows that damage to the natural environment could cause a 12% decline in GDP. That's in the near future. So that's a real warning to an economy like ours that's really heavily dependent on our natural capital, especially primary production. If we want to boost economic activity, we might remember things like this. Shoppers are willing to spend about 10% more in places having a decent tree canopy cover. Or that contact with nature actually improves people's cognitive performance, making workers more productive. Maybe we could put some more trees around Parliament and that might help some things along. or that nature is itself valuable infrastructure. I mean, just like pipes and roads, when it comes to things like flood management, urban cooling, food production, all sorts of stuff. I mean, the list goes on. It's the foundation of our multi-billion-dollar tourism industry, which supports more than 10% of our workforce. Um, and public investment is a hell of a lot more than just about dollars or exports. So it's proven that the natural world helps people's mental health. It helps children learn. It actually makes it 3 times more likely for people to want to exercise. It cleans the air, it filters the water. And I think importantly, all of this stuff it shows nature investment reduces harm in the first place. So it's preventative rather than trying to treat and pay for the symptoms. So we've framed all this in terms of diagnosis and prescription. That medical kind of lens, I think, is a really good one. Because you're doing it beforehand. You're not having to pay as much through things like hospitals, through the justice system, through the use of electrically hungry appliances like air conditioning, which goes to all the stuff that Rod's also talking about. So yeah, it's a smart investment as well as the right thing to do. And just briefly in terms of your first question, Sarah, where would I practically start? It's overwhelming, isn't it? But one thing, I think, just purely because of the timing. I'd first look to change the resource management bills pretty urgently to strengthen their approach to environmental protection. And just a plug, EDS has done some webinars on this topic if people want more detail. And fixing these bills is really important, not just for the environment, but also to prevent the continued and increasingly violent flip-flopping. We've heard about this flip-flopping across governments. That's just been so noticeable with the resource management system. So the previous government spent over $200 million just on the policy and the drafting for their legislation that was repealed within 3 months. It never hit the ground. So there really needs to be a bipartisan approach to this stuff. I'd also just say we need to invest in environmental knowledge and data. Simon Upton's talked a lot about this. Super important. It needs to be integrated. It needs to be consistent in its collection, transparent and easy to access. We need to know what the hell's going on so we can actually address it in a targeted way. And thirdly, just to finish, we need accountability. As I think Mark said, we are really good at creating strategies. We do not lack for plans, like for biodiversity, for example. And they all sound great, but they don't drive change on the ground. There's no accountability for actually doing the stuff that's written on the tin most of the time. So I'd suggest we look overseas, like the UK, a much more sophisticated approach. There are binding targets, compulsory environmental improvement plans. There's a structure around all this stuff. And there's even an independent statutory public body that can and does and has taken the government to court for failing to fulfill its environmental promises. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Greg. Lots of good things for thought there. Thank you. Rod, coming back to you and fossil fuels, your chapter sets out a very clear agenda: end fossil fuel subsidies, fix an emissions trading scheme that you argue overvalues pine forest sequestration relative to the performance of fossil fuel emissions. Let lines companies store and dispatch electricity freely. I love that one myself too. And price the full-time social costs into privately owned vehicles. Several of those would be felt directly by households and by powerful incumbents, and I know you referred to them in your opening remarks. If you could secure a cross-party agreement on just one or two of them for the next decade, which would you choose? And what's the cost of continuing to delay those choices?
So, Sarah, we live in a mixed economy where we use both markets and prices and regulations and rules to make trade-offs or choices. I believe for the rest of my lifetime and the lifetime of my grandchildren, they too will live in a mixed economy. Polarizing solutions is either let's just rely on rules because we don't trust markets, or let's just rely on markets and prices because we don't trust our ability to make good rules, is hopeless polarization that denies us use of the appropriate tools. In our current state, we have political parties that assert that their primary instrument to give effect to emissions reductions is through markets and prices through the emissions trading scheme. We need to call this out as the fiction it is. First of all, because only half our emissions are even covered, and there is no recognition or reward for the agricultural sector investing in low emissions technology and farming practices. So either you believe in prices or you don't. You can't have both ideas that you rely on prices except for half our emissions. That secondly, the emissions trading scheme, if it is to be an effective instrument, needs to be capped and reducing. And while we allow an almost unlimited amount of pine tree planting to offset our gross emissions, there is no incentive in the financial markets to reward low emissions practices and technologies. So again, it is a fiction to say that we have a policy instrument that is effective and can be relied on. And thirdly, in fixing the emissions trading scheme, we need to unwind some of the damage that is being done by uncontrolled planting of Pinus radiata on productive farmland. And while the government of the day might have made teeny moves in order to auction land that might be new to the scheme, in my view, we need to say, if you already have a forest that's in the ETS, we'll honour that promise. But we should stop as soon as possible any new carbon credits for exotic pine forests. If it makes sense to plant pine because of the industrial value of lumber and products, then that should stand in its place as a land use choice. But currently, not only are we doing harm to our pastoral lands, we are failing to address the way in which an efficient market could price and reward investments in the transition to a more resilient, low emissions future. That's where I'd put my bet, and all sides of the political spectrum could buy into that strategy tonight.
That's a nice laugh, Peter. Let's turn to you. We're going to talk about your chapter, which includes a side-by-side table showing that virtually every significant housing reform since 2017 has been introduced by one government and reversed by the next. And you argue that this churn has itself become a driver of the crisis, which I completely agree with. Your proposed answer is a durable 5-pillar settlement, which is a cross-party housing accord, decisive urban intensification, a long-term expansion of public and community housing, rental sector reform, and tax neutrality between housing and other investments. I'm so looking forward to reading these chapters, people. Given how electorally sensitive housing wealth is, how do you actually build a settlement that survives a change of government? And is there a precedent that gives you some hope?
Thank you. Yes, actually, I've just got three points, and funnily enough, there is a precedent. In 2016, we established the Auckland Unitary Plan, and it lasted until 2023. And it started under national government, and it went on through a Labour-led administration, and it resulted in house prices and rentals didn't actually decline, but their growth was 20 to 30% lower than it might otherwise have been, according to studies that have looked at it. And I've seen the Australians, who've got the same problem as we have, actually, saying, wow, look what Auckland was able to do. Let's see if we can do that in Victoria, Melbourne, Sydney, whatever. So that was a working model. Unfortunately, and Judith Collins signed on to it with Megan Woods. So, and then it was unraveled. And then we've got this other thing with 20-story buildings. And my street where I live is in uproar because somebody put up a scare story showing this huge building that towered over our tiny little street. And everyone's saying, oh, what a terrible thing this is going to be. When there actually had been medium density housing right through that period of the Auckland Unitary Plan. And you can see it all over the place. And I can see it just around the corner here. There are 5 townhouses where there used to be a single house. So, okay, so it has worked. And why not make it work again? The second thing is we now have a bit of professionalization in building rental accommodation. Simplicity. I mean, they're building apartments all over Auckland, which unfortunately only amount to about 1,000, 1,500 sort of homes, you might say. But they really do make a difference, and they show it can be done. And it shows that it can be professionalized, it can be done on budget and in time. And I visited one around the corner here. Previously, there were just 2 suburban homes. Now there's a 5-story building. I didn't hear any aggro there. It's near the Mount Albert shops, near the Mount Albert railway station, and it can probably accommodate 250 people. So you've increased the density there by 12-fold just by a single, and this is for long-term rental. And so that you assure people, one of the downsides to rental is the uncertainty. And what Simplicity are interested in, they want tenants to be there on the long haul because it's an asset class. And I think it's a brilliant concept. Up till now, it's just mums and dads and people being kicked out and all the rest of it. So that's my second concept, that actually it has worked and will work in the area of long-term rental. That's not social housing. It's at another level. When what's his name? Sam Stubbs was asked, he said, look, it's likely to be nurses, teachers, those kinds of people. So policemen, etc. The third area is infrastructure commission. We actually have an infrastructure commission that's made that seems to have tempered the polarization that we were so used to, and the bonkers decisions, frankly, the amount of money we spent doing this, that, and never delivering. And so it could be applied in housing, where we also have the same problem. We have a pipeline problem. The pipeline, the construction industry is batting backwards and forwards between all going bust or all going gangbusters. And so those are my 3 ideas. And I think it's a bit actually like Climate Change Commission. That's tempered to a degree. It unfortunately, it's not had the impact on one side of politics that one hopes it would, but it's standing there saying, hey, by the way, guys, here are some real statistics. And the Infrastructure Commission is doing the same thing. So I think between those 3, that shows you that there are 3 developments going on that have succeeded and are succeeding, and that could continue to do so.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Having sat on the Infrastructure Commission, I can say I'm a big fan, and so roll out that. Jolly good. Mark, turning to you, your proposed solution is an Auckland deal, and we do have one, or a framework of one, a standing 10-year partnership between central and local government built around a small number of durable priorities, and I think the priorities piece is critical, locked in across parliaments and drawing on things like Stockholm's congestion pricing, Vancouver's transport governance, and Dublin's planning certainty zones. You argue the failure to date has not come from a lack of intent, but from a weak national story about cities, fragmented government machinery, and volatile funding. What would an Auckland deal need to contain in a reliable, durable way to break that cycle? And what is the single change that you think would make the biggest difference here?
So the deal to fix all those problems is a big ask. And I think what we know from having looked for 15 years of experience around the world with these things is that all they are is a mechanism. And we know that a deal just by name does not of itself solve the problem. And we know that there are some deals overseas that haven't worked. So the good news is we've got years of experience to draw from. And when I finished the chapter in January, of course, it wasn't yet clear exactly when the first deal would be announced. And that framework, as you mentioned, for Auckland was launched at the beginning of April. There are 2 more deals that are imminent for the Bay of Plenty area in Tauranga and also Queenstown and Central Otago. And so the architecture is something that, frankly, addresses those 3 big weaknesses that you mentioned that we have. Cities are not prioritised in New Zealand. We have a very proud and terrific story around the rural and primary sector economy. But actually, Auckland's economic impact is vastly bigger than the entire size of the primary industry economy in New Zealand. And yet people wouldn't know that. They wouldn't think about it like that. We focus, of course, on the really important export earnings for the primary sector, which is right, but we don't focus on the exports that Auckland produces. So we have a lens problem. We can't think about dealing with a problem until we've got the right lenses on. So that's what I hope that I'm doing with this chapter, and indeed what the City Deal policy has the potential to do, to basically create a stronger narrative around cities and regions. And so it's important to say that the way the deal can benefit New Zealand, of course, is not just on the 10 or 11 cities we have. And if we look at what's happening in the Bay of Plenty and in the Central Otago area, that's a good example of the fact that it's not just big cities like Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch that will benefit. The second thing, Sarah, you mentioned is this weak machinery. So we have the core elements of city and region policy dispersed across government. Even if they're notionally grouped, a number of them within IMBI, they are, of course, housing, transport, infrastructure, and even with the bringing together of those that the government's currently doing with the new Ministry for Cities, Regions, Environment and Transport. But that's just really providing a front door. We still haven't solved this problem of joining up the decision-making in a way that's happened in other jurisdictions. So that's another big opportunity that we need the City Deal process to solve. And then lastly, the biggest perennial one is funding streams. If we don't have enduring funding streams that last governments, then we're just going to continue not to make progress. And it's not good enough just to have a big project announced, let's say like the Waterview Tunnel, and that passes into the next government and the next government stays with it because the spades are already in the ground. That's not good enough. So an enduring framework for funding is also a key element that needs to come from a successful Auckland deal. There are 4 specific focus areas. One is this idea of a smaller number of durable priorities. An Auckland deal or a deal for anywhere doesn't need to cover everything. It should focus on the transport, housing, innovation, productivity priorities and get those locked in from a consensus point of view. Secondly, it has to create a new central local government partnership. As big as Auckland is, we know that local government generally in New Zealand is weak internationally. We know, looking at the OECD, we're at the bottom of the table in terms of the amount of control and influence our local governments have. The City Deal needs to change that structure. Thirdly, predictable funding, as I mentioned. And fourthly, what I'm calling a public scorecard. For this to matter, it's got to matter to people. It's got to matter to people in a way that they can see this. And so overseas, you see these public scorecards, that quarterly reports, for example, on how the deal's performing in terms of things that matter for citizens. So that's a great way both to engage the public and to help them keep politicians focused on the deal. You asked about a single change. I mean, the one single change would be a clear, unambiguous political consensus that lasts. And look, we've got the signs of that. Chris Hipkins, in his State of Auckland address in May, committed to the city and regional deal. Carmel Sepuloni's interview with Wayne Brown, if people have seen that, said the same thing. But it's not just to agree with the idea, because we've had plenty of governments agree with ideas and then change the substance. So there's got to be the kind of concentration on the specifics that allows difficult choices, like congestion pricing, for example, to not take 10 years to still not even get implemented. And that's why Stockholm, Vancouver, Denmark have examples of these difficult choices that by having more stable institutions, they're being able to make more progress on. That's what the deal can provide for us.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that's a really good way of rounding out the conversation around choices. And as you know, Mark, personally a huge advocate of priorities and prioritising. It's absolutely critical, and linking it to public scorecards and consensus. I like that very, very much. Now, I'm really conscious we have a heap of questions, and I know the foundation may want to think about what they do with, they're quite specific, a lot of them. So what I am going to do, actually, rather than turn to the specific questions, sorry team, is I'm just going to do the closing question to the panel because we only have 5 minutes, and I think maybe the foundation can think about how they address the questions that have come through, because I think they're very, very valuable looking at those. But I do want to finish with a closing question to each of you so that we keep to time. And the through line of the whole book, and you'll see that has come through this really wonderful, rich conversation, thank you all very much, is that the solutions to these problems need to be durable. We need cross-party solutions that outlast any single government. I think we hear the word bipartisan a lot. I think people are getting a bit turned off personally by that word, and perhaps we could start moving to words like consensus and durability and long-term. We are, as I'm sure everyone is aware, we are in an election year. So what is the one commitment that you would most want to see major parties agree on in your area? What's the single question that you would urge voters to put to candidates who are going to come knocking to their door or stand outside their supermarket? What is the one thing that you would like that commitment to be? I'm going to go in the same order that we've been going. Greg, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'll try and keep this real quick. I think it's hopelessly naive to expect the detail of environmental protections to be something that's described as bipartisan. I don't think that will ever happen. But what we do need is an absolute commitment to having a stable, predictable framework, the legal framework for resource management and environmental protection. We did it in 1991 with the Resource Management Act. We need a similar coming together now with the bills that are currently before Parliament. In particular, I would just like to highlight the idea of regulatory relief. So that's the idea that landowners need to be compensated for public interest controls on things like biodiversity. And, to me, this is one of the most pernicious kind of things to enter our legal frameworks for the last generation. And it may be flying under the radar slightly. So I do think that is one of the most important specific things, if we're thinking about door knocking and politicians, to be talking about.
Rod, what are you going to be asking the people outside your supermarket or knocking on your door?
I would hope that we can reinstate in New Zealand the concept of independent, evidence-based, expert advice that guides public policy in the national interest. That when our elected leaders hold office, they're not there just to pander to the vested interest and stakeholders that put them in office. They are there to run the country in the interests of all New Zealanders.
Nice. Peter.
Well, this is a difficult one. I was sort of scratching my head. I would suggest, why not put the argument in the chapter is that we should consider housing as an essential part of our basic infrastructure. Why not put housing as one of the areas that the Infrastructure Commission should be looking at, and in particular helping us organise the pipeline of production, which currently is just so unhelpful.
Excellent. Mark, final words to you.
Mine's easy. All major parties have to adopt the current regional deal and commit to improve it and fund it. It's the deal we've got. Everyone will want to make changes. Two very unlikely people, Christopher Luxon and Wayne Brown, agreed on this deal. So it's the start. So use that as the basis to then improve and fund. And the question, to ask candidates is, will you back it? Or are you going to be happy to continue to have Auckland not make the progress it needs to make in New Zealand's interests?
Wonderful. What a wonderful conversation. I'm going to pass back to Sarah, but Sarah, you've got so much to work with there, and I think the book's going to fly out the door because it is just so fascinating. I can't wait to read it myself. Got it on pre-order, but really wonderful. I know that everyone in the audience will be thanking Greg, Mark, Peter and Rod. That was absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Sarah, I'll pass back to you with 1 minute to go, I think, right on time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks for your expert moderation there. And thanks again to Greg, Rod, Peter, and Mark for a fascinating conversation. Just the kind of conversation that we want to be driving through the foundation. Particularly loved Rod's closing comment about following the evidence. That's exactly what we're here for. So thank you all again. Thanks to our audience for joining us today and for all of that amazing engagement through the chat and the Q&A. I'm really sorry we weren't able to get to your questions, but we will take them away and have a look at them. And hopefully many of them will be answered in the book. So please do pre-order, take a look, and we'll be thinking about how we can sort of reflect this engagement as we go forward. And in the meantime, we hope to see you at our other 3 webinars in this series starting next Wednesday. So thank you very much to all of you and have a great afternoon.